I'd rush it, but there's no point. Welcome to every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 3 Reviewed. This time around it's only a half season, only 13 episodes. So what's my opening statement? The very first episode I watched of Season 3 was Spike at Your Service. Make of that what you will. Anyway, as I already very recently learned, it's really hard to hear what I'm trying to say for some reason, so heck it, let's just get into the video. And to the 15% of you that actually watched this far into the video, I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Episodes 53 and 54, The Crystal Empire. Twilight and her friends are tasked with saving the Crystal Empire from King Sombra, who for some reason, a villain we have never even heard of before this episode is referred to as It in the opening. Why is that? I have no idea, but that's what they did. You know who I thought It was? Queen Chrysalis. I mean, Nightmare Moon was reformed, and Discord has turned to stone, so of course he won't be wreaking any havoc, but part of my cynical opening statement. This episode is really good. What's basically going on here is that Princess Celestia is grooming Twilight to become a princess of her own, which we'll find out by the end of the season. And to accomplish this, she tells Twilight it is her, and only her alone, that must be the one to save the Crystal Empire by getting the Crystal Heart and retrieving it so the Crystal Ponies can ward off King Sombra's ghost. How the main six are to accomplish this is to basically learn as much as they can about the Crystal Ponies' history and get their spirits up, because it's necessary for the Crystal Heart to actually be able to function. Honestly, I found this back and forth really fun to watch. And there's even some cool callbacks, like how Rarity is a very quick speed weaver as we learned in Winter Wrap-Up. It leads to a story with a lot of tension and really cool moments, especially the moment where Twilight and Spike view into their worst fears. It really shows you just what kind of characters these two are at their core. Twilight is scared to death of the idea of disappointing her mentor, Princess Celestia, and Spike feels indebted to Twilight. It's especially powerful considering his earlier feud with Aloysius. I also really appreciate what this episode did for Spike, like by actually making him a significant part of how the story is solved. Because she fears she won't be able to make it out of that trap in time, she leaves it to Spike to basically avenge her and save the Crystal Empire for her. Even knowing darn well that this very well may mean that Twilight will fail the test that Celestia gave her, she's willing to fail if it's for the benefit of everybody else. It really goes to show just how much Twilight has grown as a person from Friendship is Magic Part 1. Back then, she was really only in it for herself. Now, she's fully concerned with looking out for others. It's honestly a really cool climax. Now, of course, this episode wasn't perfect, but for what it's worth, I thought it was great. But let's talk about some of the issues I had with this episode. For starters, the Part 1 cliffhanger was really kind of dumb. Basically, by the end of Part 1, Cadis's magic fails for just a brief period of time, and it gives King Sombra an opening to basically get some of his magic inside the Crystal Empire. Now, it's just me, but I honestly think that the fact that they needed a real Crystal Heart and not a cheap copy of one would have been plenty enough instead. I probably would have had Princess Cadis's magic give out just as Twilight was about to get to the real Crystal Heart anyway, but that's just me. Another thing is that Shining Armor just doesn't get to do very much in this episode. I mean, yeah, he throws his wife like a javelin at the Crystal Heart and Spike to save them both from falling to the ground, but I find it very weird how his horn is cursed, and Cadis was using that shield of love and whatever else for allegedly days. But if Shining Armor's specialty is shields, why wouldn't he go first? I mean, yeah, after he got cursed, it was perfectly understandable, but before that, it's really weird how he doesn't do anything. But yeah, that's really all I have to say. It's cool though that this episode does give Princess Cadence some backstory now. Like, she's the princess of the Crystal Empire, whereas in A Cancel That Wedding, she came out of nowhere. But I excuse how she came out of nowhere in that episode because, well, future episodes can exist and they can always explain to us stuff later too. And A Cancel That Wedding had plenty of story to tell on its own already anyway. I also really like the villain King Sombra. Yeah, he doesn't get to do very much, but the thing is, he's been fended off for the entire episode. And we hear from Princess Celestia what would happen to the Crystal Ponies if King Sombra was allowed to return. So he's already left quite an impact on the story as is. And the post-traumatic stress inflicted on the Crystal Ponies from his reign has already been very well demonstrated. I think that about sums it up really. Good episode. I liked it. Let's continue. Episode 55, Too Many Pinkie Pies. Pinkie Pie clones herself to be with all of her friends causing havoc in Ponyville. This episode is a gem. The truth of the matter is that before this episode, I didn't really like Pinkie Pie very much. I still liked her, but this is the episode that got me to really love Pinkie Pie. Not only is this episode genuinely really funny, but I also absolutely adore the dilemma here. Pinkie Pie wants to hang out with all of her friends, but she can't because they all have their own things going on at the same time. And so she plots to be with everybody all at once by going to the mirror pool and cloning herself. The clones themselves are not mentally all there, but they have no physical deformities. And it leads to an all-out invasion where nobody can tell who the real Pinkie Pie is, and the real Pinkie Pie even starts doubting who she is anymore. That's actually a very complex conflict for a character to experience, being the original but not even being sure if you're the original anymore. Being surrounded by clones of yourself but feeling completely and utterly alone. It's simply fascinating. It also helps that this episode is chock full of really fun moments, from the mispronunciation of the characters' names, to once again seeing Pinkie Pie bend the laws of physics so that she can actually be courteous to her own friends. There is no shortage of gags. This episode would honestly fit right in with good SpongeBob. In fact, it kind of reminds me of an episode from Season 6, Overbooked, an episode where SpongeBob SquarePants tries to be with everybody to help them out with all their tasks, but physically can't do it. But the only difference is that there, the solution was caused by cloning himself. And here, cloning Pinkie Pie was what started the conflict. And it's not just Pinkie Pie that's really funny here too. I thought Fluttershy has some pretty funny lines. Like saying she wouldn't have fun anymore if it means that Pinkie Pie won't be missing out on anything. And if they're not funny, they're just being really cool, like how Rainbow Dash doesn't really mind if Pinkie Pie's gonna hang out with Applejack. It's just those tiny little details that really reinforce that these are really good friends hanging out with each other. And might I also add, it makes the conflict a lot stronger too, because Pinkie Pie just wants to hang out with everybody, but it doesn't feel like she's being forced to do it, it's all entirely in her head. And it all climaxes to where all the Pinkie Pies have to watch paint dry to determine who is the real Pinkie Pie, which, might I add, has to be one of the absolute funniest moments in the entire show. Not just as a concept, but it also leads to a lot of really fun visual gags. Ladies and gents, you haven't seen true horror until you've seen G3 Pinkie Pie as a reenactment in this episode. Send that Pinkie to the mirror pond and never bring her back, please. Yeah, this is a very much good episode. I can't talk too much about it without spoiling so many of the jokes though, you really have to watch this for yourself. But trust me, that's 22 minutes you will not regret spending on this show. Something I unfortunately cannot say for the very next episode. Episode 56, One Bad Apple. Apple Bloom's cousin comes to visit and turns out to be a total bully. Now, to some of you, it's no surprise that I call this episode a nightmare episode. After all, I already made a video detailing how I would have fixed this episode. But in that video, I was talking about what this episode could have been and how it could have actually been a really good episode. In this video, however, we're going to talk about what this episode actually is and what my problems with it are. Let's start with the moral. Now, I 100% agree with the moral in that you should always tell an adult, if possible, that there's something going on first before you do anything else drastic. It's not always applicable, but I can't get behind a moral like that because it really is the first thing you should try. And given this is a family issue, Applejack very well could have done something if she was told first. It's also implied much earlier in the episode that she does know more than was actually being let on. Take note, when Applejack tells Apple Bloom that she has something in common with Babs, she mentions how they both don't have their cutie marks yet. But when Apple Bloom asks Applejack why she didn't bring that up earlier, Applejack seems hesitant to really tell Apple Bloom the reason why. This moment does foreshadow that she does know more than she's letting on about Babs being bullied back in Manhattan. However, even knowing that, that is absolutely no excuse for letting that out at all if you were worried about her being singled out. Especially the way it does happen in this episode, it comes out of complete freaking nowhere. I said this before, I'll say it again. If Sweetie Belle at the very least tried to console Applejack ahead of time, and Applejack told her that she does not believe that Babs will become a bully so quickly after she had to leave from her own bullies back in Manhattan, this will become significantly more believable. Also, while I do agree that you should tell an adult first if you're actually getting bullied, I do not agree with the idea that you're a bully for standing up to a bully. That is actually a very dangerous moral to teach the kids. A more appropriate moral would be that two wrongs don't make a right. And it doesn't help that the moral that they try to teach is not reinforced by this episode. Applejack doesn't do anything when she sees Diamond Tiara and Silver Spoon teasing Apple Bloom and her friends right in front of her. If you're gonna teach a moral about how adults have to be told if you're getting bullied is the first thing you should try, you should actually have the adult do something. And speaking of Applejack, it seems very out of character for her to be so concerned over Babs not being treated very well, but at the same time, never checking up on her to see how she's doing in Ponyville. Then again, if she was in character in this episode, she'd likely see that Apple Bloom was sleeping on the floor. Applejack is a very family-oriented pony. The fact that she wouldn't think to at least check up on her little cousin is very unlike her. This episode also suffers from a very strong blunder, namely that Bab suffers absolutely no punishment for anything that she does. No, instead, she gets absolutely no penalty. She gets to bully her own cousin and her friends off of freaking peer pressure. And yet, absolutely nothing bad happens to her. It seems like a very unfair way for this episode to go in her favor. I mean, the CMC try to get back at her, but there's another problem with that. Namely that in the real world, if you try to fight back against a bully, you could be the one in trouble. A fact that this episode makes absolutely no attempt in addressing. What I'm trying to say is that while I agree with the moral of this episode, I don't agree with how they went about it. It feels really clunky and that everything wasn't really thought all the way through. Also, why does Babs tell Applejack about being bullied back in Manhattan but not her own sister? Yeah, yikes. I talked about this episode for a lot longer than I was planning on. But when it comes to bullies, I have a lot of experience with that. And seeing how this episode was handled, it really provoked me, let's just say that. But there were some things I liked about this episode also. The transition from Babs being okay to being a bully itself was actually pretty smooth. There are plenty of hints to show that she really is just really self-conscious, and the decisions that she does make do make a little bit more sense when you understand the context behind why she does them. Though I'll admit, it's sad to see Silver Spoon regress so freaking heavily after our Family Appreciation Day. The song itself is also really good. But that's really all the positives I have to say about this episode. Other than those few things, this episode was bad. And not bad as in good either. Episode 57, Magic Duel. Trixie returns to enact her vengeance on Twilight and company. Yes, you heard me right. Trixie has made a return to My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. After a humiliating debut and a relatively small cameo, she's back and more villainous than ever before. And I am really happy about this because I feel like Trixie has a lot of potential that's untapped as a character. However, here, she's not quite herself. No, she's returned with a vengeance, and she has a special little trinket called the Alicorn Amulet. A dangerous little trinket that amplifies the user's power but corrupts the user. And it leads to a lot of really cool visual gags, from the magic duel that happened at the beginning and the end of the episode, to seeing just how relentless she is with throwing around Twilight's friends and Sips and Snails. Yeah, if it wasn't obvious enough, there's a lot about this episode I really like about it. For starters, I believe this is the very first episode to establish that Twilight's magic actually has limits. No, to defeat Trixie, she's not going to get ridiculously powerful magic, she has to learn to be creative with her magic and what she actually can do. And I really love the idea of beating a villain not with brute force, but with pure and utter wit. Which, if you ask me, is exactly what a duel should be. I also find it very fitting that a street performer like Trixie would be defeated not by brute force, but by basically not being able to see through Twilight's illusions. Remember that line in Ghostbusters? Anything you could do, I can do better? Yeah, in the case of Twilight being better at this stuff than Trixie is, that still remains true. There's also some good continuity nods in there too, like the Ghostbusters reference with the mustache spell, and the Paris sprites. But that's just the Twilight side of things. As far as Trixie, I freaking love how she acts in this episode. She is utterly ruthless. Not just to Twilight's friends, but also to Snips and Snails. And considering that these two are really freaking annoying characters, not to mention that they're a huge factor in the fact that Trixie has to work on a rock farm just to make a living, yeah, it's actually really justifiable as far as why Trixie hates them so much. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I enjoy seeing them get pushed around by Trixie too. So yeah, if you couldn't already tell, this is a good episode in my opinion. Though to say it's flawless, I wouldn't go that far. Let me just throw this out there, Fluttershy is by far the weakest part of this episode. And for one reason, her timidness is exaggerated. Hard. Now, I can totally understand not wanting to see her animals get hurt with Twilight's levitation magic. After all, in a past episode, she knows how it feels to be held against her will doing that kind of stuff. Though to this episode's credit, the animals at least enjoy being levitated around. No, my problems come with the fact that Fluttershy is like really eager to go back into the dome, even though that the animals managed to get her out and are trying to get to help her to get to Twilight so that they can actually save everybody in Ponyville. Now, I can totally understand why she's hesitant to actually leave the dome, because if she gets caught, you have absolutely no idea what Trixie could do to her if she tried to escape and she was caught doing it. But why would she want to go back inside after she managed to escape? Fluttershy may be timid, but she's also very much brave when it comes down to helping others. At least 3 previous episodes have established that. And most of those episodes were in Season 1, so you can't really use the argument of continuity not being a factor here. It honestly feels really regressive for her. Yes, I know the term is actually supposed to be flanderization, but I don't agree with that terminology. That aside, this was a very solid and fun episode. Episode 58, Sleepless in Ponyville. Scootaloo tries to impress Rainbow Dash when their friends go camping. By now, both Apple Bloom and Sweetie Belle have been plenty developed as characters, but Scootaloo is mostly blank slate. That being said, this episode also builds up in quite a bit of continuity. For example, Scootaloo idolizes Rainbow Dash, and there's tons of callbacks to previous episodes. The Headless Horse story from Look Before You Sleep, Rarity getting rescued by Rainbow Dash and Sonic Rainboom, Rarity acquiescing for Sweetie Belle and Sisterhood of Social. There are lots of continuity nods in this episode, and it's actually really cool to watch. As for the plot in this episode, Scootaloo wants to look all tough and brave in front of Rainbow Dash so that she would accept her as her big sister. Not in flesh and blood, but let's say in spirit, like an honorary sister. It's a sweet story, and all the other characters have their chances to shine too. Especially Applejack. I actually really like her in this episode. She's very attentive and pays very close attention to how Scootaloo is feeling. It's almost as if she had experience with being a big sister. What do you think? I also love how Rarity carries herself in this episode. She is still as prim and proper as ever. And the give and take of having to go camping with Sweetie Belle and her friends, but having her still be pulled around by Sweetie Belle is really fun to see. Also, we have to acknowledge this. This episode does a great job at establishing why the characters in this episode actually had to be here. In Look Before You Sleep, I had absolutely no idea why Rarity was in that episode. The circumstances surrounding that episode made it out of character for Rarity to actually even be there helping around. But in this episode, and thanks to Sweetie Belle no less, she has legitimate reason to actually be here now. With that in mind, this episode avoided a very serious pitfall. There's also another blunder that I'm happy that this episode managed to avoid. Namely that Rarity and Applejack are actually acting their age. Instead of bickering like children, they're actually being the bigger mares here, recognizing their little sisters being afraid of Rainbow Dash's stories, but comforting them all the same, just leaving Scootaloo all alone because, well, she has no big sister to lean on. There's one more thing I want to mention before declaring this episode what I think it is, and that's Princess Luna. I really like the role she's given in this episode. Because she's, well, nocturnal, it makes a lot of sense that she's actually a princess that can wander through the dreams of other ponies. And she does serve a very significant role in this episode in finally having Scootaloo confront her own fears of not being brave. And it leads to a very sweet ending at the end of the episode too. I also really like the moral of this episode too, as in not everybody starts off brave. And Scootaloo should not feel ashamed for not being brave as she started off either. But yeah, this episode is a good episode. I wouldn't call it perfect, but I do think this episode is really good for what it is. Episode 59, Wonderbolts Academy. Rainbow Dash begins her Wonderbolts training. So, you know how in Magic Duel we already saw that Twilight had very real limits to her magic? This episode gives me the same impression but with Rainbow Dash and her flying ability. She's still an extremely gifted flyer, in fact she's the second best on the Wonderbolts Academy right now, but only second to her foil Lightning Dust. A Pegasus as fast as Rainbow Dash, if not even slightly faster, but is also much more bold. And it raises the question of whether or not it's really worth going above and beyond to prove yourself if it's at the expense of others. Not just Rainbow Dash, but the friends that she holds so near and dear to her as well. Quite the dilemma. I guess I should come out and say it, but I like just about every character in this episode, from the main six, especially Pinkie Pie, to Rainbow Dash, to Lightning Dust, even to Spitfire. I know there are some people that do not like Spitfire in this episode because they act as if she doesn't really remember Rainbow Dash at all, but it's important to remember that she's on the job, and picking favorites isn't professional. She's also shown to have very strong logic too, and some of her ideals do also line up with Lightning Dust, in that she really wants to prioritize the fastest and best flyers they have. Which is why Rainbow Dash had to serve under Lightning Dust and not over her or any other pony. And Lightning Dust's point about the Wonderbolts being the best of the best flyers out there is also a very important point to bring up. After all, if members of your military are weak, you'll have a weak military. Whereas Corrupted, however, is that she's prioritizing pushing your limits over the safety of others. Which is ultimately where Rainbow Dash had enough. And yeah, while I like every character in this episode, I love Rainbow Dash here. The ending where she's actually quitting her dream of being a Wonderbolt, if it means risking the safety of others, is a very powerful moment for her. It also makes Rainbow Dash look a lot more wise. Even in previous episodes where she was training to try and better herself, you can see that she was training deliberately away from other ponies to not risk hurting anyone else. It really makes Rainbow Dash out to be a very good person. And then there's Pinkie Pie, who I have to say is really funny in this episode. There are times where it does feel like she's detracting from the main focus of the plot, but it really does not bother me. There's just one more thing I want to talk about, but before I do, this is a good episode. So, the ending. A lot of people really don't like this ending. I will say I'm not necessarily crazy about it, but I don't think it's a bad ending honestly for this episode. What it looked like to me was that Lightning Dust got kicked out of the Wonderbolts because of how she was such a reckless flyer. I hear some people wondering why the ending was scrapped and that the original ending was so much better for this episode, but I don't really see it. So you all know, the original ending for this episode was that Spitfire actually demoted Lightning Dust to being a wing pony instead of a lead pony. Which I'll admit would make a little bit more sense in context thinking about the fact that Rainbow Dust got promoted, but who's her wing pony now? That is a legitimate question. However, I also like to see it this way, in that I wouldn't want someone that reckless and dangerous on my team. Otherwise though, yeah, the ending is really abrupt. Just, it doesn't really bother me that much either. Episode 60, Apple Family Reunion. Everyone is here at the Apple Family Reunion, and Applejack wants to make it one to remember. Now before getting into this review, let's establish something. We have no idea how long a moon is supposed to really be. However, I think it's safe to say that it's been about at least 2 years since Twilight came to Ponyville. I say this because the Apple Family Reunion is every 100 moons, and the last confirmed date we had at Apple Family Reunion was Applebug Season, episode 4 of the show. Now if in the future I said that only like a single year has passed, well I give up. But for now, that's my headcanon. Now let's really talk about this episode. Well, it gives me a very Party Pooper Pants vibe from Bad SpongeBob. In that episode, SpongeBob tried to get everybody that attended his party to run the party by his own schedule. And in this episode, Applejack is trying to run her family reunion like it's basically on a very tight schedule, trying to have everyone act in a way that only she wants them to. And the reason why is because this is the only chance that she believes she'll ever have where her entire family is able to get together on this one very special day. Honestly, I can buy it. Now, you could argue that this plot would make more sense if it was Twilight, but here's the thing. Applejack's family is massive, and she likely does not want to disappoint anybody either, especially not her own family. However, just because I find the conflict believable, doesn't mean I find the episode to be good. Let me explain. If the episode was instead about how the apples were having so much fun with their reunion, but Applejack was really getting into her head because she wanted the reunion to be perfect according to what she thought it should be, maybe just seeing problems that aren't really quite there. I feel like I like this episode a lot more if they actually did that. Instead, we get to see Applejack turn her family reunion into basically a sweatshop. And I'm sorry, but it's just not funny to me. It's like that she forgot, in trying to make good memories, she forgot that the memories themselves have to come from actually having fun moments. It can't be something that's forced. And it's a real shame too. I'd have loved to hear more about these characters and their backstories instead of having Applejack do what she was doing in this episode. Not only that, but if all the apples did have more time to have more fun in the episode, it would make the climax a lot more sweet too. When the barn is destroyed and Applejack is in despair, she could have felt like a failure, but her family could have also reassured her that this was the most fun they've ever had at a family reunion. It also would have made that song about raising the barn, as well as just seeing everyone having such a good time raising the barn too, feel much more like a labor of love than like actual work, which all these characters already had to do in this episode. Speaking of work, Applejack knows her Granny Smith is elderly, and yet, for some reason, she got rid of her rocking chair, as well as her sisters I'm assuming, to make room for some sewing machines. Okay, first off, what happened to tradition over modernism? Secondly, these ponies are old. You can't make them stand up for an elongated period of time. It's highly unethical for Applejack to not think about that. Heck, around that moment, I was wondering why didn't Granny Smith say anything to Applejack about how she was treating this family reunion? I get why Applebloom doesn't, she's just a child, so odds are Applejack wouldn't listen to her. But I 110% believe that her Granny Smith would at least call her out. Also, I have a very hard time really believing this, and it's really mostly a nitpick, but I just have a very hard time believing that Babs is Applebloom's favorite cousin. Don't get me wrong, I can at least appreciate the fact that Applebloom is so forgiving over Babs and how she was acting in that episode, but it just feels like it's way too soon after one bad apple. And their history before this episode has been strictly negative too. I was originally going to call this episode just okay, but upon rewatch, I just found more problems with this episode. I like the moral, but again, it just feels kind of weak. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I have no choice. This is a nightmare episode! Episode 61, Spike at your service. Applejack saves Spike's life, and he in return swears his life to her. I have to be honest, I don't want to talk about this episode. I really don't. Listen, after Dragon Quest, I am sick and tired of there being so many bad Spike episodes in the show. And this episode is no exception. I don't hate this episode more than Dragon Quest or Owl's World That Ends Well, but my god, this has to be the absolute most bombastic example of character development I've ever seen on the show. Spike the Dragon, who's been Twilight's assistant for as long as he's ever been alive, all of a sudden becomes entirely incompetent when having to serve under Applejack. Even though previous episodes have demonstrated that A, he's a very proficient cleaner, and B, he's extremely good at cooking. Say what you want about Owlsworld the Enzel and Dragon Quest, at least those episodes to an extent understood Spike as a character. In this episode, not only is he out of character, he's actually out of canon. I don't know what I watched for the last 22 minutes, but this is not Spike. This really should not bother me as much as it actually does, but it really does bother me. I don't believe that I watched Spike be an idiot for 22 minutes straight. That is not Spike. And it's not just the fact that he can't cook or clean, it's the fact that despite what we saw in the Season 3 premiere, Spike seems to be completely fine with telling Twilight that he can't serve her anymore because he now owes his life to Applejack, even though his worst fear in the Crystal Empire is not being needed by Twilight anymore. Instead, he treats this like a freaking breakup, like he won't be able to see his girlfriend anymore. And we're just supposed to accept that Spike can be this extremely incompetent, but he can also tell a real Timberwolf from a fake? Really, let's talk about the Dragon Code. In Dragon Quest, it's established that Ponyville has absolutely zero information on dragons. A, how should Applejack know how important the Dragon Code is to a dragon when even you yourself, Twilight, know there's absolutely no information on dragons in Ponyville? B, we learned from Dragon Quest that dragons are terrible people, and previous episodes like Dragonshy and Owlsworld and Enswell go on to corroborate this. So how would anyone know what it really means to be a noble dragon? And C, and probably most importantly, Twilight, you're aware of this Dragon Code, but you're perfectly okay with allowing him to say that he owes a life debt to anyone that saves his life? By that same logic, what about Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash when they save his life in secret or by excess? How about Princess Cadence and Shining Armor when it happened in the Crystal Empire? Do y'all see that quote on the screen right now? Because that's what I think about this episode. It's a nightmare episode! And the funny thing is that I've only been talking about Spike in this episode. All the main six likewise have their moments too. For example, Applejack is pretty cool in this episode. I do like to see where she saves Spike's life, and the Timberwolves are looking pretty cool too. However, even then, she also has some really dumb moments. Like when she and Spike actually had to evacuate from the Timberwolves, and somehow, the same Earth Pony whose hind legs can suck downward careening cars and shake apples out of trees, can't take her hind hooves from under a rock. Not to mention, the way that the Timberwolves are ultimately defeated feels extremely anticlimactic. Especially considering that Spike, a dragon, can breathe fire! Why not burn the Timberwolves to the ground? Okay, well, how would I have at least fixed this episode if I had the opportunity to? Honestly, quite simple. Have Spike be actually competent. Remember, Spike is not perfect. Remember that in Owlsworld and Enswell, he accidentally burned one of Twilight's books with his fire breath by sneezing at it. So to an extent, he can fail, like when accidentally tipping over that bucket full of soapy water and dropping all those eggs and trying to get them down. But instead, just have it be that Applejack doesn't feel comfortable having Spike serve under her. Keep him competent, but give Applejack some pride. That one little change would have fixed so many problems with this episode. Moreover, you wouldn't make it look like Applejack was actively being inconvenienced by Spike's presence. Instead, it'd be more like she appreciates his company, but she also wants him to be feeling more like he's free to do whatever he wants. Everyone else, however, that I didn't mention was mostly fine. Pinkie Pie was pretty dull. I didn't find her funny in this episode. Same with Fluttershy, she didn't get to do very much. But both Rainbow Dash and Rarity did have some charming moments. I did laugh a bit seeing Rainbow Dash topple down that rock tower. And it was kinda cute to see Rarity eat some of that pie that Spike made. On a side note, I heard this was originally a Rarity episode, which honestly would have made this story make a lot more sense than Applejack. How far would she go to tolerate Spike if this episode was featured around her? Not to mention, we don't have a single Rarity episode in Season 3. Episode 62, Keep Calm and Flutter On. Princess Celestia tasks Fluttershy Discord's reformation to the charging of her friends. This episode was tricky. As in, when I first watched it, I had absolutely no idea how I felt about this episode. Though the hardest part about reviewing this episode is that I got into the show around Season 4 when Discord was already reformed. And Celestia's plans for Discord only really made sense in Twilight's Kingdom. Before that, they really don't make any sense at all in this episode, because they're not explained whatsoever. Now, Celestia has never been straightforward, but considering that these are the main six we're talking about, the ponies that were nearly defeated by Discord before, she should really at least explain why she needed Discord for any reason. As is, it feels like a fool's errand for the main six, at least barring Fluttershy. And yeah, it makes perfect sense why they have so much distrust towards Discord here. Not only do they not really believe that he can be reformed, but it also makes a lot of sense that this is something they really did not want to do. That being said, they do have a tendency to go too far in this episode. Let's just get this out of the way. Of all the things I'm really happy that Discord did do, it was eating all the reforming spells in Twilight's library. I'd say Discord is more chaotic neutral in the sense that he really just likes to do what he does for fun. At least in this episode, I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case for the actual premiere when he was actually a villain. But something has to be said with effectively erasing someone's memory and then making them whatever you want them to be. Like, that's way more evil than anything Discord's ever done, let's be real here. And I already have my gripes of unicorn magic and how they can basically levitate other ponies like they're ragdolls. I guess right now we should talk about Discord. Now, Fluttershy's plan here actually makes a lot of sense. In a show literally titled Friendship is Magic, you really have to remember that friendship is the most powerful force in the world in this show. So the mission she chose is to befriend Discord any way she could. Some people like to argue that Fluttershy is actually trying to control Discord, and while I can see why, I don't agree with that idea. It's important to note that Fluttershy doesn't entirely trust Discord either. One of the first things she says when Discord says that he'll be going to Fluttershy's cottage for a bit is that he may be horrible, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to be hospitable. I love this line, as it's basically Fluttershy's way of saying that two wrongs don't make a right. And it really gives the impression that she is trying to be genuine too. Admittedly, this is one time I really wish the fandom nods would not be present. The fact that she's using the stare would give the impression that she's trying to control Discord. However, to my knowledge, we don't get any information on what the stare actually does until season 9's She Talks to Angel. An episode where Angel point blank says that Fluttershy's stare forces him to act against his will. Let's just say it's a very good thing that episode came out 6 seasons after this episode came out. So I really can't count that episode against this one. So I had to really think about how this episode was playing out with how Fluttershy was acting in contrast to her friends. The rest of the main six, especially Rainbow Dash, is very adamantly and vocally against Discord in this entire episode. And while we can see why they're getting very reasonably upset at Fluttershy for not siding with them, we have to remember that Fluttershy does defend her friends even when they're not there to hear it, which Discord chalks up to Fluttershy being understanding. Now this may be just me, but later on during the dinner party, this actually makes a lot of Discord's actions a lot more justifiable. Take note that when he gave life to the gravy boat, it didn't attack Pinkie Pie at all. However, it had spared no expense at Rainbow Dash when she insulted it. To me, this means that when Discord can bring objects to life, they have their own ego. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to say that an object with its own ego can act independently of Discord's actions after being brought to life. After all, there is evidence of magically animated entities being brought to life, and then acting independently of the user that actually called it to life. It's also this scene right here that really does spark that Discord really began to trust Fluttershy. She says right here at this very moment, because that's what friends do for each other when Fluttershy sticks up for him. Admittedly, I think the reformation took way too little time. Now, it is possible to befriend somebody in an afternoon, and I do believe that Fluttershy did do enough to really say that she will let Discord act however he wants to, but I would have liked if it was at least implied that more time was spent trying to reform Discord. A transition or time lapse would go a very long way in that regard. Another thing to talk about though is Fluttershy's line about trying to gain Discord's friendship any way she could. Let me put it this way. I don't believe that Fluttershy is the kind of pony to try and manipulate others. Yes, she can be shrewd, but when it comes down to manipulation, she's not really good at it. However, I feel like people really downplay Fluttershy's intelligence. For example, in Mystery in the Friendship Express, she managed to hide herself in plain sight by playing the role as an engineer in front of Pinkie Pie. And the very next episode of Cancel Wedding, she faked being a changeling so that the changelings would not attack her. Fact of the matter is that she's not stupid. She recognized that when Discord finally had a friend, it was something he was not willing to lose. But that's another thing about the moral about this episode, and that being friends doesn't mean you can always get what you want. Discord has to cool the chaos a little bit for Fluttershy's sake, but Fluttershy also made the first move in giving Discord free reign to be whatever he wanted to be inside her own cottage. Which, at least to me, says that Fluttershy is willing to be very fair to him. Yes, you could argue that this moral was already said in Sisterhood of Social, but A, this wasn't phrased as a letter to the princess, and B, this also means that this lesson is applicable to friends too, not just family. The ending of this episode, however, mystifies me. Celestia still doesn't trust Discord. So little so that she's leaving the elements of harmony with the main six. And after Fluttershy's little line of, "See, he's a real sweetheart once you get to know him," everyone just looks so awkward and unsure of the future from that moment forward. Which, yeah, I'll call this episode good because at least it's being realistic, but it gives such a big air of unease. Like, are we really sure that anything's really changed? Well, only time will tell. There's just one more thing I have to mention in this episode, and that's the humor. Not only does this episode have a lot of good jokes, but seeing Discord bully Angel never gets old. In fact, Discord's antics in general are always fun to watch too. It's always just really fun to see these animators and what they can do with Discord with some creativity. But yeah, with this episode we finally broke a nightmare streak. Way to go, keep calm and flutter on. Episode 63, Just for Sidekicks. Spike pet sits the main 6 sidekicks while they're at the Crystal Empire. Yep, another Spike episode. Not the greatest start, as I've become kind of biased against Spike's episodes since they're in general pretty bad, but this episode is an episode in its own right, so I must be fair. Let me just throw this out there. While I do think this is a better episode than the one that come after it, which, yeah, spoilers for games Ponies play, I kinda like that episode more. But for this episode, Spike is pet sitting the pets for the main 6, and the truth of the matter is that he doesn't care about the pets, he just wants what he can get out of the main 6, the jewels. Which is something that I can't buy. Spike is a pretty good person in general, but as we have learned in Secret of My Excess, he can be pretty greedy, and it is his dragon instinct kicking in. And I only really realized this on my second time watching the episode, but that's the entire reason that Sakura took one of the jewels after, promising to help Spike, and basically gives it away to charity, because she knows that Spike is not going to really be able to do his job well, as long as he was still clutching onto those jewels. And the less Spike has, the more selfless he becomes as a person. And it turned out that watching all these pets was a lot of work for Spike too. Especially if it means having to watch Angel, who I just have to say is near on insufferable in this episode. Now, I understand why he acts the way he does. Fluttershy spoils the heck out of him. And the guy isn't deaf. He knows that Spike doesn't care about him or any of the pets at the main 6, and would basically rather be anywhere but here. And to be honest, when I saw all the pets rolled up into a single ball and then just being rolled around, I could kind of see where he was coming from at that point. So yeah, that's why I say near insufferable. I can at least see where Angel's coming from. And by the end of the episode, when Spike really does confess that he was in the wrong for how he was acting in the episode, Angel does in fact forgive Spike and to do make amends too. Which, to be fair, I would say is relatively earned, as Spike was being selfish and he did have to pay the price for how he was acting in this episode. So I can't really call this episode bad because the story itself does make perfect sense. But would I call this episode okay? Well, no. Again, I say that I don't like this episode as much as games Ponies play, but I do think this is a good episode. Truth of the matter is that this episode involves not only Spike but the Kingdom Crusaders quite a bit, which I have to say is a unique pairing. And yeah, they lead to some pretty funny moments. I really like that quote from Scootaloo, by the way. I do have some questions in regard to how currency is handled in Equestria. After all, the jewel that Rarity gave Spike is apparently worth a lot of money. And as we know, Spike eats jewels. So why would Twilight be so okay with Spike basically eating her cash? You ask me this, and I in return would then say, Spike's been saving his jewels for who knows how long to bake this cake. And though we do know he likes to eat jewels, he doesn't really eat them very often throughout the show. One of his friends is Rarity, who's also known for being able to get jewels very easily thanks to her own magic, which would also imply that the jewel that she gave to Spike would be worth a ton. And if Spike is saving those jewels up, then that means he's not tapping into Twilight's funds either. At that point, he can do whatever he wants with them. So yeah, this plot point doesn't really bother me at all. Seeing the pets in action was also just really fun to watch for some reason to me. And it was really cute to see the main 6 playing with their pets before they departed for the Crystal Empire, especially Rainbow Dash and Tank. But yeah, a good Spike episode, that's all I can really ask for. Also, Pee-wee actually made it back home. Take that, Dragon Quest. The more we can forget your existence, the better. Episode 64, Games Ponies Play. The main 6 welcomes the Games Inspector of the Equestria Games. So this plot is supposed to take place at the same time as Just for Sidekicks. And as I said before, it is definitely the weaker of the two. Let's just start off by saying that it's very confusing as far as who's this episode really structured around. I'm not sure if it makes any sense, but this feels like a Rainbow Dash episode that doesn't really star Rainbow Dash. Anyway, the plot. Princess Cadance enlists in the help of the main 6 to welcome the Game Inspector of the Equestria Games. The catch, they get the wrong pony, and it is very stupid as to how they do. The only thing that Twilight mentions about her is her suitcase, not how she looks, not her name, none of that. And the weird thing is that they actually say her name when Princess Cadance is talking to somebody else that actually knows what her name actually is. If all they did was ask that pony what her name was, they could have saved themselves from so much trouble. Though as it turns out, this may have been a blessing in disguise. Miss Harshwinny is used to being introduced to towns and cities that put up a big show and rather wants to be shown a genuine experience. Which all I can say is, yeah, that does actually happen in the real world. Though it does lead to a pretty funny conclusion to the story in which the pony that actually gets a really extravagant experience, i.e. the tourist, has a lot to love about this place, and well, it really makes you think. Being always exposed to all these happy, cheerful introductions must be getting really tiring on you. But hearing that account from somebody that's not used to that kind of invite, yeah, that would be really exciting for them. And it's kind of funny that Miss Harshwinny wants to just cut the bull and instead show an authentic experience, so it's not really that out of left field. And to be fair, this had to be one of the absolute funniest episodes I've seen in this entire season. The idea of the main six just showing this one traveling bumpkin a really good time, I find is really funny. Especially the part where she's running on a racetrack and causes so much destruction like a battering ram, all the while spouting out incomprehensible gibberish. But still, I just have to say it. With the exception of Rarity, and maybe to an extent Pinkie Pie, the main six here are pretty dumb. Especially Rainbow Dash, who for this episode really gets into her own head a lot. There's also some questions that are still unanswered, like in Just For Sidekicks, we hear that for some reason Spike was not invited to the Crystal Empire. But why not? Isn't he credited with saving the Crystal Empire? Why would they not want him back? I guess we'll just have to wait till season 4, huh? Oh well. I had a lot of fun watching this episode, but it had a lot of flaws to it too. So not good, but not nightmare episode. This is actually our first and likely last okay episode of season 3. And here I thought this season would be truly divisive. Episode 65, Magical Mystery Cure. A spell gone wrong changes the true selves of Twilight's friends. This is the big one. The one where Twilight goes from being another unicorn to one of the 4 princesses of Equestria. And all I have to really say is, wow, they managed to fit a lot into 22 minutes. No joke, the second time I watched this episode, I got an entirely different experience out of watching it. And all the same, it was positive. My god, where do I even begin with this episode? The conflict here is that Twilight accidentally managed to swap all the destinies of her friends. And it's up to her to help her friends realize what their destinies truly were meant to be. Now, not all the destiny swaps are perfect, but to be fair to the writer of this episode, I'm really not sure how I would have fixed them. For example, Rainbow Dash only remembers who she really is when she does the weapon for Rarity. But her cutie mark was a result of doing a sonic rain boom, which Rarity could never really hope to do. On the note of Rarity, however, her cutie mark has to do with finding jewels. But in this episode, it's to do with fashion. And here, I can't see where they could have done it better. After all, being an earth pony, either she could dig for gems, or she could use her hind hooves to instead kick down boulders and try to see if there are gems inside. Ultimately, however, I do think these are pretty minor problems to have with this episode. The rest of the swaps, I think, are actually pretty dang smart. For example, Pinkie Pie is all about fun, and hard work isn't really fun for her. Fluttershy has a severe case of anxiety and hates being laughed at. And Rainbow Dash, well, can't talk to animals, so go freaking figure. But that's just the conflict. Something else to mention is that this episode is actually a musical. And yeah, that took me by surprise because I'm not used to hearing more than 2 songs per episode. And while I'm not crazy about this decision, I do understand why it is a musical, because there's a lot to digest, and music is one of the absolute best ways to get across points in very little time. And to this episode's credit, all the songs I really do like the sound of. The tone shift that I find sometimes really funny to listen to. The mood of each song just switches around so freaking quickly, it's actually crazy. One moment everyone is happy and cheery and the sun is shining, and just a few minutes later, everyone looks like they're ready to kneel over and die because it's just so sad and gloomy. I'm actually kind of ashamed to admit, but I laughed at that moment. This episode also has a lot of really cool touches to it that I only really noticed when I listened to other people commenting on this episode. For example, when Rainbow Dash is clearing the clouds for Rarity, you can actually time it, and she clears the skies in 10 seconds flat, which is a very deliberate reference to Friendship's Magic Part 1. I guess right now, I can talk about some of my theories. So I'm just thinking about that spell that Twilight cast by accident. How is it possible that their true selves were altered? I guess it's possible then that their paths are different now, which would also mean that the main 6 were all destined to be together if their identities were tied so closely to the elements of harmony. Which makes me wonder, did Celestia know this would happen? because she told Twilight she let her keep the elements of harmony just in case, after keep calm and Flutter on. Did she really have plans for Discord, or was she setting up for something else here? If she was setting up for Twilight's coronation, then would that mean that Discord being reformed would be a fluke? Because if so, then that's a really underhanded way of going about it. Another thing, if you were to argue that the spell taking place acted as if their lives were completely different leading up to now, then why was Ponyville so lively in the beginning of the episode where everything took place in a single day? Because it seems like one day without Pinkie Pie made everyone miserable. So instead I had to change my thinking around, instead thinking that their lives had to change on a dime and they were continuing where they thought they left off. It would make sense because even though all the trees in Sweet Apple Acres are dead, and you would not consider that Pinkie Pie would be able to kill every tree so quickly, it was Rarity doing all the weather, and we do see it being winter for a brief period of time. And thanks to Family Appreciation Day, yeah, trees don't take very long to grow. I too have to ask though, where the heck Apple Bloom, Big Macintosh, and Granny Smith were before the main six came by to help Pinkie Pie? But again, 22 minutes, so I guess I just have to accept that. Yeah, I really wish this episode was 44 minutes long, because it does feel like it's also pretty rushed. However, this episode also does have an advantage over Friendship is Magic Part 2, namely in that these characters are already developed, and so it has continuity to write on now. There's just one more thing to talk about, and that's Twilight becoming a princess. Just gonna say, I got into this show in Season 4. By that point, Twilight already was a princess. But as far as how this episode goes about it, I really like the moral here. The episode up to now was basically talking about how you should not blindly follow your destiny, and if you're not happy where you are, then try to experiment and find something else you really would be good at or you would enjoy doing. However, when we see Twilight's ascension to being a princess and her road leading up to now, the episode is also saying you shouldn't blindly ignore or turn away from destiny either. Twilight's friends were very clearly unhappy with where they were in life. But everything we've seen from the very first episode to now has shown that Twilight is very much qualified to be a princess. Not only does she embody all of her friends in some way, shape, or form, but she's also a fantastic leader. And well, this may be my own bias, but I can kinda relate to Twilight in this situation too. You know, the future is scary. You don't know how it's gonna be in life when you go forward on this new path. But at the same time, you know it's the right path for you, and there's only one direction to go. Forward. Yeah, this is a very personal episode for me. All in all, I find this episode not only really good, but it really got a lot of emotion out of me too. You could chalk it up to liquid pride, but that's just it. I'm actually proud of Twilight, and I'm really looking forward to seeing this show develop in Season 4. And that is every episode of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic Season 3 reviewed. Before mentioning my notes, let's move on over to the statistics. There were 8 good episodes, only 1 okay episode, and 3 nightmare episodes. More than 2/3 of this season was good, and not even a quarter was bad, and the bad episodes were all still better than the worst of seasons 1 and 2. Meanwhile, the good episodes ranged from being simply phenomenal, which most of them were, to being at least really logically solid and still having a lot of good moments to make them worth watching. So yeah, this was a good season, though only really half a season because it was only 13 episodes. I don't really have much in the way of notes though. Really, this season just felt like more of Season 2, except maybe that there are less moments where there are morals delivered directly to Celestia, and well, the main character is no longer a unicorn, leaving only Rarity to be the only unicorn for the main 6. Speaking of which, this is a season where Rarity doesn't get a single episode all to herself, which is kind of a shame. Literally every other character had at least one episode dedicated to them. Pinkie Pie has too many Pinkie Pies, Applejack got Apple Family Reunion, Fluttershy was given Keep Calm and Flutter On, Rainbow Dash had Wonderbolts Academy, and of course, Twilight got episodes like Magic Duel and Magical Mystery Cure, whilst even Spike got just For Sidekicks and Spike at Your Service. I guess we'll just have to wait until we see what happens in Season 4 for Rarity. Now we've reached the part where I'd recount the top 5 and worst 5 episodes of Season 3. But since there's only 13 episodes and one's a 2-parter, I'm instead gonna just give the top 12 from worst to best. And it'll be my next video too. We good? Good. With that said, thank you to Ricardo for being a channel member up to now. I really cannot stress enough how much I appreciate your support. And with that said, I'll see you next time.